So you may have heard it said in the past that the only true way to improve your landscape photography is to learn composition. Well, I'm here to tell you that's true. And if I knew that back then, I wouldn't have spent hundreds of dollars trying to buy my way into good photos. Well, in this video, I have 7 compositional tips to help you improve your photography so that you don't spend hundreds of dollars trying to do so with camera gear. Hey, what's up guys? Welcome into the channel. My name is David Johnston and I help you improve your landscape photography with online video. So if you're into landscape photography, if you want better photos, subscribe to this channel and ring the bell so you can be notified when future video comes out and you can learn to level up your images. Now, in this video, we're talking 7 compositional tips for beginners. Even if you're not a beginner, hey, this video is probably gonna reveal something in your composition that you may need to improve on, or even you may not have even thought of before. So let's jump right in. The first is crops and grids. And crops and grids is one of the last things that I actually learned. Not so much the grid work, like the rule of thirds and the golden mean. And if you've never heard of the rule of thirds before, it's basically dissecting your viewfinder or your live view into thirds, both horizontally and vertically, so that you can place your subjects on the lines and where they intersect for the best possible placement. So when I say best possible placement, it doesn't always work that way. I sometimes put the very subject in the very center of my frame, and that's just how I like it. That's how guidelines work instead of rules. But also, not only grids, but crops. Crops help you divide your frame out into the subject and what's not really necessary within that. So what I do with this is kind of envision it in the field, but I do it based on what I've learned in Lightroom. So if we go over to my Lightroom screen, you can see this photograph here that was shot in Joshua Tree National Park of just some rock formations in midday. And what I love about this is that it's so simple that a 1:1 crop did it justice. So you don't always have to use whatever crop is straight out of your camera. You can go 5:7, 8:10, 1:1, 16:9. You can go a really long one like a 16:3 and get that panoramic look. It's just what you want to use in your photography based on what your subject matter is in your images. So for example, let's take a different photograph and look at different crops and grids in Lightroom that we can actually use. Yet let's use this photograph for example. So if I go over to the develop module, I can hit my crop tool and the crop tool comes up. So what I basically do is just hit the O key on my keyboard until I find a grid on here that I do really like. So sometimes it's this diagonal one, sometimes it's just this quadrants, sometimes it's something like this. And when I get to something like this grid, it helps me visualize where my subject is and where my lines need to be. So with this one here, you can see that the leg of this tree lines up and then it splits into this vertical tree trunk that's kind of cut off at the top, right where that grid line intersects. And then I also have this rock at the bottom coming in on this, and this rock is lining up with this line here. You can of course adjust this crop to get what you want, but you can also use different aspect ratios to crop this into different looks. So I could use something like a 1:1, get a different look, maybe that works. Maybe I think this is better in a 5:7 view, so I can hit 5:7 and see if that crop works. And I can just play around with these. You never know when a square crop is gonna give you a better option than a 5:7. You never know if an 8.5:11 is gonna look better than a 1:1. It just depends on what your subject is doing and how you've composed it and lined it up within your frame that you can work towards. And you can visualize this once you've practiced it enough in post-processing. So always remember that. Don't start editing your image until you've really explored all the crops and grids that can help you complement what you've already composed in the field. Number 2 is leading somewhere, and I've done this so many times when I was starting out in landscape photography, it's not even funny, putting leading lines into a frame just because they were there. And leading lines are a great tool to use in your composition for landscape photography, but one, they can't be forced in, like you can't force a non-distinct dodge and burn, shadow and highlight that doesn't really hold a strong line all the way through your foreground. And you can't have them just sitting in there and not leading you somewhere. So leading lines are used to direct the viewer's eye towards something in the frame, typically your subject. So here's what I mean by this. If I go to some of my images that I've taken in the past, I have a photograph like this. It's a forest in Maine that was just a really fun hike to go on, and I thought the boardwalk was a really cool leading line to use throughout the forest. And yeah, the line leads you through the forest, but it doesn't really lead you to anything. There's nothing back here to see. So if I zoom back out, you can see this line really serves no purpose in the composition whatsoever. However, if I rethink this and reframe it, using a subject in my photograph, say a hiker that's going along the trail, I can redefine that leading line and have a stronger subject point within my composition that I set up. So instead of the line going nowhere, I now have a line that's leading directly to this hiker here, hiking through the forest. Now, it's really interesting to watch what leading lines do and what they do to the subject, because they can point to a subject and make it stronger, but your subject placement along those leading lines can make your composition even stronger than that. So what I mean by this is a bonus tip is placing your subject in front of negative spaces or solid colors. So if you see this hiker, if I zoom in, he's basically in this little window of a solid green here. There aren't any trees directly in front of him that are going to occlude him or distract from where he is in the frame. I have another example that I love for this technique, and it's this photograph that I took right at sunset in Rocky Mountain National Park. And I was using this water here as a leading line using a telephoto lens, and this bull elk stepped right in the middle of this frame and stepped into this negative space, and I stepped over to avoid some of these branches coming in and have him standing directly in this solid color space of negative space and frame that subject matter up perfectly. So you want your subject to stand out. You want your leading line to be something that complements that subject by leading your viewer to it and then leading your viewer to a subject that is very distinguishable from the rest of your image as well. Number 3 is shooting in layers, and by layers I mean different ways that you segment what your subjects are doing throughout your image. So I've talked about subjects for your photography, but what about complementary lines and complementary subjects that are also present within the frame? Those have a place too, but they don't have a place as the subject does as the main idea of your photograph. So let me take you through another photo example of a waterfall. And here you have some foreground subjects of these rocks that I used a circular polarizer so you could see through the surface of the water to the rocks on the bottom to have them as a foreground element leading you through the frame and to the waterfall itself. And then I have the waterfall, which is the subject of the photograph. But I also have the forest in the background. That's kind of like your tertiary subject or your third subject. So you want to do foreground, midground, background. Foreground, midground, background are 3 different layers, and using these in unison with one another is going to give you really good compositional results because it's not just foreground, midground, or foreground, background. So you don't have to use all 3 of these, but it does make your composition a lot stronger when you figure out ways to compose a scene when you do have all 3. Foreground, midground, and background. I've discovered in my experience it's really difficult to find midgrounds. It's really easy to find foregrounds and backgrounds. So something like a mountain range and a foreground feature. But if you have a mountain range, a midground line of trees, and then a fence post running through that kind of leads you through the foreground, that's going to make a really strong composition that you have all 3 foreground, midground, and background for. I've kind of used the sky here and there as a background with my midground since I don't live around epic mountain peaks and I'm not around those all the time. So you can get creative with what your background actually is, but just keep in mind to have a really strong background, you need structure to it. You need some compelling features to it. So some dark shadows and bright highlights, or a lot of color in it if you're going to use the sky as your background feature as well. Number 4 is be a storyteller. And storytelling in photography is one of the best ways to really improve a photograph and improve a composition, but it's also one of the most difficult things to do, I've found, because it's so easy to see a landscape in front of you and photograph it, but it's really hard to wait on the right moment to have complementary subjects, the smaller parts of it, that make up a place or an adventure or a trip or a travel experience. So to kind of show you how I do this is using this photograph that I shot in Kenya when I went on safari, and we had these really cool Land Cruiser safari vehicles that we could stand up and shoot out of the top in. And I was really captivated by these layers and kind of the golden sunset that was happening and some of the dust that was reflecting that golden light of the sunset. And I noticed that as the cars were driving down the road, it would kick up this dust and really add to the composition. So I waited on one of these vehicles to get closer to us, and I used my telephoto lens to stack the distances of this winding road down here and the layers in the background of the landscape, and also get a lot of that light, that golden light, and use the car as a complementary subject to kind of tell a story of the entire photograph, to give the viewer an experience of what it actually looked like, so they could hear the car down the gravel road, they could taste the dust as it got in their mouth and maybe feel it as they got in their eyes. So you have to really think about what would tell a complete story here. And it doesn't have to be a man-made object that you could use to tell a complete story. You could use, fall leaves as your complementary subject to tell a story of time of year or seasonality that you were in a place. So you can get creative with this as well. Number 5 is called create connection, and really this tip has a lot to do with how you want your viewer to feel. I don't know if you've ever noticed during cinematic movies, they use this technique to create an emotion in you as you're watching a film. So if there's a really distressing part or a part where you're supposed to feel very anxious about something, what they'll do is they'll use the subject's placement within the frame and maybe a side portrait, and they'll push it further towards this side of the frame so you don't have as much space over here as you do over here. The direction of flow and having this stopping point really quickly creates anxiousness. Whereas if I'm further over here, I have more space to move around on this side, and there's less pressure, there's less angst within the frame. You can do the exact same thing with your photography. And I found this out through a various display of mess ups, and I'll show you what I mean. Here's a photograph of a lighthouse that I shot in Ireland. And I do love this photograph. I love the color within it. I love the subject. I love photographing lighthouses, and it's a great memory for me to hold on to the photo for. But really, this photograph creates a lot of angst within me because I don't have enough space over here on the right side to give that space for breathability. And it just creates this very claustrophobic feeling when you look at a composition that doesn't leave space to explore one side if that's not what you're going for. So the mood of this photograph doesn't match the angst of it. Maybe if this was a little bit darker, like a black and white, maybe something like that would match the angst that it makes me feel with the lack of outflow in the composition and the direction of that cliff face. So we can look at another option here that shows a different outflow. So this is when it's done well. I have an outflow with this waterfall, and putting the outflow on this side of the frame would create angst because you wouldn't get a conclusion to the story. You would be cut off from that, and it would create this inconclusive feeling of anxiety. Moving that outflow by just stepping over and moving your tripod, you create an outflow that has conclusion and that has enough space within this composition to have an outflow and to have time to explore and really frame up your main subject here well. So there are multiple ways that you can use not only lines, but subjects, rocks, water, leaves, trees, anything you can think of to not only create angst, but also create peacefulness with how you want your viewer to see the photo and feel while looking at the photograph. So that's a really important tip to use when you are photographing for emotional types of landscape photography. Next up is mirroring lines. And when I say mirrored lines, what I'm thinking about are lines that either have same shape or have stackability to them. And in stackability, I'm talking about photographing with a telephoto lens that compresses distances together and allows you to stack ridges against one another. Here's a photograph that I shot in Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And you can see these lines that are really highlighted by the sun peeking out of the clouds. And then you have these deep shadowy valleys that are intersecting between them. And shooting with a telephoto lens, you can stack these similar ridge lines together and create that compressed, almost like a pancake look of these stacked mountains that you can get. Now, mirrored lines can also mean having lines that look the same but that are doing opposite things or flowing in opposite directions. This is a really difficult one to see a lot. I've found that shooting something like sand dunes, you can do this very easily in, but I've also found it very easy to do this technique in mountain peaks and ridge lines and valleys. So here's what I'm talking about. You can see this photo on my screen of this ridge line of this mountain face that was being illuminated at sunrise has a specific flow. The tree line has the same flow, it's just kind of flipped down below it. So it has the same shape, they're just going in different directions. And I think that's a really fun feature to play with. It looks really nice together whenever you can find it and photograph that. So I would always just look for lines and shapes that are very similar. So if you see a recurring theme throughout this video, it's that landscapes are made up of lines and shapes. And when you can pair those together and create repetition or mirrored effects, or have them point to a specific subject, you're probably going to end up with a very good composition. Not to be outdone, number 7 is repetition rewards. And nature is full of patterns and repetitions if you just slow down and look for them. This tip is especially useful when you're photographing really small scenes like plant life. And I love photographing plant life because what it can do is give you an idea and a sense of the fine details of subjects that make up a grand place. So I used to photograph grand landscapes only, but it wasn't until I started to notice the really small details that I fell in love with intimate scenes and small scene landscape photography, like desert plants, for example. Desert plants are full of repetition and patterns that just kind of unfold out from the center. And I think figuring out a way to compose this central point and then repetition around it is a really good example of why the rule of thirds doesn't always work out. It's more of a guideline to help you in chaotic scenes. In peaceful repetition scenes, maybe placing the center of your subject at the very center point of the image is the best way to go. You're the photographer, you get to decide that. But you have all these repeating patterns and leaves that come out of the center that really create a peaceful scene when you're doing this. It doesn't always have to be desert plants though. Other plant life is all around us, like these new ferns in spring that had repetition coming out of the fern fronds, and photographing these at a really, really shallow depth of field using a macro lens helped me capture the repeating patterns of these fern fronds as they kind of unfolded in 3 in unison coming out at the camera. So I always say when you see repetition and you see really strong patterns in nature, not only in small scenes, but in big scenes too, that could be mountain ridges again, going back, using that repetition over and over in a really nice sunrise scene to photograph these very well. So repetition really matters. If you want to see all of these tips in action when I actually am in the field photographing, be sure and click on the playlist that's showing up on your screen right now. And again, subscribe, ring the bell, and like this video if you got any value out of it.